This year's our 50th Telos anniversary. I wanted to welcome everybody in beautiful Marina di Ragusa. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mary Picone, so welcome. I thought it would be really perfect to host here in Ragusa. I am the publisher of Telos and have been the publisher since 2004 after my late husband, founder, Paul Picone, passed away. And I'm really honored to stand here and say that we have made it to 50 and couldn't have done it without the amazing team, including my introducing Russell Berman, who has been an amazing support to me personally, but also taking on as editor of Telos, as well as bringing in new faces and certainly looking forward to more. I'm really excited about that, as well as wanted to thank Adrian Babs for his work in this conference and doing a magnificent job with the program. So thank you so much. As well, David Pan, our executive director of the Institute, couldn't do it without you. So thank you all. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Russell Berman.
And if there's any misbehavior, we'll track you down. Thank you all for coming. Is this working? Can you hear me? No. Can you hear me like this? Yeah? Okay. Welcome to this Telos conference. Thanks to Mary for her support. Thanks to the Telos Institute, David Pan, and thanks especially for Adrian Paps for pulling together this conference in particular on the endurance of empire. Many of you have been at Telos conferences before, so welcome back, so to speak. And I see some new faces as well, so welcome to this community that has carried on an ongoing discussion about a set of interlocking issues over well, Mary said it, 50 years. The topic of this conference, Endurance of Empire, includes endurance, and Telos has endured as an independent journal in an adversarial setting, and we're proud of that. But our topic is really empire. Yes, the time, the endurance, but it's really about empire and space and the implications. Let me say a couple of reasons why this is of significance for Telos. Telos has addressed many different issues, many different philosophers, many different political theorists over the years. But if there's a theme that goes through the journal for half a century now, it has to do with the complexities of universalism. Let me put it that way. The complexities of the notion of normative claims, allegedly pertaining in all situations, and the resistance they face in the particularities of human existence. Working through that tension between the universal and particular is something that is, well, maybe the brand of Telos. This is what we do. It was relevant to our reading of Edmund Husserl at the beginning of the journal. It was relevant to our engagement with the Frankfurt School and Adorno, and it's certainly relevant to our engagement with the writings of Carl Schmitt and other figures. What's particular and what's universal? How do regimes prevail over the multiplicity of existence? How is sovereignty even possible over and against the multitude of different positionalities? Now, to zero in more to the endurance of empire, I'd say this is an urgent issue for a number of reasons. In intellectual life, at least in the United States, I think this may shock, this may provoke. I want to talk about something like the obsolescence of anti-imperialism. That is the rhetoric of anti-imperialism that prevailed during the Cold War and in the era of decolonization. It's become very stale, and it's become associated with positions of power, actually, in the intellectual world, which are now sort of crumbling. And some of the affairs that are rocking the American intellectual scene right now, it's the paragons of anti-imperialism who are being caught with, saying, their pants down on a variety of issues. That there's something mendacious about that. That's not an advocacy for empire, but there's a staleness to anti-imperialism that leaves it crumbling for us. That raises then the question of empire again. I won't get into the historical perspectives on that. I expect that to be addressed in some of the papers, but I'll point to a second dimension that I believe is pertinent, and that is when we look at world affairs in these years. What's pretty clear is that the end of history is now historical. Right? The end of history is over. The notion of a monopolar world that seemed strangely credible in 1989, 1990, 1991 is clearly gone. And instead, we see competitive adversariality among major powers: the United States, China, Russia, and smaller sidekicks. These aren't nation states that are competing with each other, although they all have some nation state characteristics. They're empires. And that's the reality of contemporary global politics, where the fiction of the United Nations, that each little nation state was somehow on par with the big players, is now being exposed as untenable. We should talk about that transformation of the international system. And then thirdly, empire versus nation state is really the question of the universal in particular. Empire and nation state is about the difference between a aspirational homogeneity in a nation state. Think of all the controversies around immigration right now. That's really what's at stake there. And on the other hand, regime over multiplicity. That is empire. Is for the proponent of anti-imperialism, is nationalism really the better alternative? On the other hand, for the critic of nationalism, is a globalized regime impervious to diversity the better alternative? These are the kinds of questions that I want to see us debate in the next couple of days. Empire is not just a historical category. We can learn a lot from that history, but empire is with us now, with us here in Sicily, right? This site of so many historical empires. And let's see what we can pull out of this challenge of empire in terms of political theory and philosophy. So that's what I have to say. And we will move to Adrian. You going to make some remarks now?
Well, given where we are in terms of time, I think it might be best to move to the first panel in just a minute, because we're slightly behind schedule. We want to certainly enjoy the long breaks for conversation. We want to have a chance to walk around and stretch our legs between the various sessions. But what's lovely about this venue, I've only just arrived, is that it does feel, in the nicest possible sense, like we're in the middle of nowhere. That is, you can't escape. There's no bar or restaurant to go to. There's no, incredibly beautiful church or palace to visit. So it's a bit like Hotel California. You're here and you're sort of stuck for the next 2 or 3 days. Exactly. It's all part of the plan. I wouldn't exactly say it was an imperial strategy, but almost. So just really to say thank you all for making your way. I know some have traveled incredible distances. I think the longest distance is southern Chile, which is really impressive. But actually, no, Australia, of course. It's always outdone by our Australian friends. Until we get someone from New Zealand or Fiji, I think our Australian friends will always sort of lead by example. No, it's really wonderful that you could all be here. It's the 50th anniversary, which is so important because it's about celebrating the incredible legacy, but also, of course, theorizing the contemporary. That's, after all, Telos' mission, if you like, to try and have a critical theory of the contemporary, to tackle big questions like empire, because empire is also capitalism, empire is also certain culture, it's perhaps also the resurgence of civilization. So it's a big, big question, which is about space, it's also about time. The Imperium used to be linked to a sense that this was a temporal realm between the fall and, if you like, the eschaton. And so the question of time is coming back into things, as we just heard from Russell. We've now have history back because it never ended, and the end of history means that we have to take time far more seriously than we have done. The importance of historical mediation, the eruption of ontology in history. These are all questions that in some sense pertain to empire, because empire is about how to organize life in this world, including the natural universe. It's also about rethinking relations to nature. So there's a lot of questions I think we can connect this to, and I think some of the papers already are suggesting that empires take very, very different shapes and forms, and I'm really looking forward to all the sessions. So without further ado, can I introduce the first panel? The session will be moderated by David Pan, who I think needs no introduction, but since he's not going to do it, out of modesty, I will. David is the executive director of the Telos-Paul Institute, professor at the University of California, Irvine, and of course a long-standing associate editor of the journal. Has been effectively running the annual conference in New York City that many of you have attended over the last few years. And has also started a cycle of international conferences in Australia, in China, and elsewhere. And one of the conferences was with Wayne Hudson, who's somehow inserted himself in this panel, and I'm not quite sure why. But you are on this panel, but you aren't Wayne. But it feels rude to remove you from it.
I was in the panel on one of the documents.
Really? But not the first one.
Oh, I'm not here. Okay, that's good.
You're on the part of the plenary debate, yes. You're the next one. But actually, David and Wayne organized together a wonderful conference on naturalism, which is now been published. And so this is also what Telos has been doing. The annual events in New York in January or February each year. We do the Europe conference every other year, and we do international events whenever we can. Many of you came to the one in Moscow last September, and we've got more planned for the future. David will be saying a word about the Institute just before dinner. And David, I shall leave you to introduce our speakers. So thank you all very much. Welcome to the conference. Great that you can be here. Looking forward to it all.
Thank you. This panel is on a border power impact. Thank you for being here. I think I introduce very briefly each speaker before they speak.
You need the mic.
Oh, okay.
Hello? Okay. So, welcome. I'm just going to introduce each speaker briefly before they speak. So, our first speaker is Lars Erslev Andersen from the Danish Institute for International Studies. And his paper is entitled The Concept of Order, the Post-Westphalian European System of States, and the Hubris of the Idea of World Order After the Cold War.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm one of the newcomers. I'm here at the conference, Telos conference for the first time. I'm looking very much forward to it. I just saw the announcement at the internet, and I thought, okay, I have been reading quite a lot of articles from Telos, also some of the books. So I thought this is the place I would like to be. So here I am. I have been a bit nervous for my presentation because it is not possible to talk about all these three things in 15 minutes. So I hope that you will forgive me that I can see the chair is very keen on time measuring, so I have to speed up already. I think I will concentrate on the first part, namely the concept of order, and I think it's an important concept. Why am I interested in that? It's because I'm writing a book, a rather large book on, I call it World Order as Will and Intuition. It is, of course, a quote from Schopenhauer, an intellectual history of world order and the war on terror. And it consists of two parts. The first part is conceptual history of order, and other concepts. And the other part is area studies on two empires in one region, namely United States, China, and the Middle East. Of course, it is planned for 400 pages with the agree with the publisher, so I can only touch some of the issues. And I will outline what I think about when it comes to order. Let me first say why order. There has been a lot of writing about order, but there has been not much writing about the concept of order, the definition, the reflection of the concept in itself. We have seen histories of order in philosophy, in religion. We have seen a lot of order books coming out, especially after the end of the Cold War. We have also seen Carl Schmitt's book, Nomos der Erde. He delivers actually a short definition in the beginning of the book, order and orientation. And of course, I will pick that up. But I have been a little bit frustrated because I couldn't really find a discussion on what is actually order. So this is what I'm going to talk about now. I have three approaches to this discussion, one pragmatic, one theoretical, and one historical. And I will not read the historical, but we will have time for discussion. I think, of course, order, you meet this concept everywhere when you're talking political theory, political history, and all these kinds of things. So that's my motivation for going into this. Based on my studies in classical Greek philosophy and science, and also inspired by Carl Schmitt's book, Nomos der Erde, and by his contemporary professor, Reinhard Koselleck, I first deliver a pragmatic determination of order. And I see it as constructed in 4 dimensions. First dimension, space. And the interesting point here is that you can think of eternal space, but you cannot visualize it. This means that every time you are discussing or dealing with the concept of space and you try to visualize it or to have an idea of it that is not in pure thinking, it will always be limited. It will always be some part of the eternal space. That is, that we are thinking in a specialized way. And that means that the other dimension, the second dimension that is important, is border. There is, when we are thinking about order, there's always a border. There's always an inside or an outside, a we and the other, which sometimes could intensify into an enemy-friend relation, but not necessarily. The third dimension is, of course, time. When we are thinking about order, and I'm talking about order in all kind of ways. We always see it situated in time. There's always a before and an after. And that means that order is always building up a narrative. And this narrative is always, in a way, a judgment that is in somehow ethical. And that means that the fourth dimension that is connected to my pragmatic determination of order is norm or normativity. And that goes for hierarchy. We will always have an over and under. We can make the philosophy of history as a series of orders, like, for instance, Hegel going from the Orient to the German state or the Prussian state. And clearly with a development from primitive to more development, so on. So this is always built into, there's always a normativity built into. This was the pragmatic approach. Then I asked myself, with inspiration from the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, is order actually an intuition like time and space is in the epistemology of Kant? And I started out reading about this because I was curious if you could so to say conceptualize or not conceptualize but determine order as an intuition, an Anschauungsform in the Kantian sense. And my answer, after studying the so-called transcendentale aesthetic in the beginning of the critique of reinen Vernunft, critique of purism, I said, no. And I don't know, how much time do I have? 8 minutes, fine. It's a very, very interesting discussion in the beginning of this book by Kant from 1881. And it's about space. What is space? And he picked up the discussion between Newton and Leibniz. And I cannot go into that. But Kant's conclusion is that space is not a concept. I conclude order is not a concept. On the same line of argument that I find at Kant. But my finding is also that order is not an intuition. It's not an Anschauungsform. Why? Because it always, as I already outlined, is involved in judging aesthetic, ethical, and normativity. So, and therefore it cannot be an intuition. It's already involved, so to say. So then I started studying the function of the epistemological process as Kant outlined it. And we should not repeat all the Kantian stuff here, but I paid special attention to his small paragraph, so to say, on transcendentale apperception. And this is interesting because here he summarizes that the process consists of 3 syntheses. One from perception to placing the object in time and space. The second one with the Verstand, the categories. And the third one when the Vernunft, the reason, start questioning this. And if you see here, we have 3 syntheses, and that is actually 3 orderings. We are, in this process, ordering 3 steps. And that leads to my conclusion that in this process, where we have from the perception to the construction of the object as my object for discussion and investigation, there is 3 steps of ordering. And this process is not a process that is, now I'm telling about it in a narrative, but it takes place instantly, spontaneously, almost unconsciously. So, and this is my invention here. So, what is order then? And my conclusion is that you, in order to make you oriented in life, in the context where you are, for the things you are looking at, you are ordering. So order, and you cannot help it. You cannot avoid it. You cannot. It's back behind your back. It just takes place. So, and therefore, I make the definition that I see order as a desire. Order is a desire or a will, and it's on the same level as a desire to sex, for instance. Uh, and and this is the most important conclusion in my reflections on order in Kant. And therefore, my book is called Order, World Order as Will and Intuition. And this leads me to a few more conclusions that I could take up here. It leads to this observation that there is always in this process a combination of thinking and feeling. So you cannot divide these things. You cannot make, not even in the purest mathematical thinking, depart from feeling. Because when do you feel home in the order you create? For instance, when you create an equation or whatever, it is a feeling of pleasure that Kant takes up in his third critique. Or it's a feeling that it's not ended of discomfort. And this leads me to the next step, and I guess I'm out of time already, but it opens for the next step in my analysis, and that is with this combination of thinking and feeling, pleasure and discomfort, and spontaneous ordering leads me to take up Nietzsche and the will to power. I start not by the will to power because I needed to explain what we are talking about, but the first attempt he had in his first book with the building up of nice forms, ordering in literature, architecture, politics, and whatever. What he called the Apollonic attitude. And the other one is, of course, the exact opposite, the destruction, the Dionysic feeling of joy by building or deconstructing forms. And I think every time we are talking about order, and it's of course especially interesting when we are talking of order in the form of world order or liberal order or other kind of social order, that it is always a combination of a belonging to the order or not belonging, a feeling and a thought, and it's always, and then I heard the introduction about universalism versus the particular, and it's always a limiting. And therefore, my last part in the announced paper was to see that this limitation or this ontological determined limitation of any kind of order thinking was forgotten when George H.W. Bush in 1990 announced the New World Order. And of course, there were quite a lot of states, of empires, of people, especially people that did not belong to that kind of thinking, and therefore, of course, had some kind of opposition to it, and still have. I think, yes. Sure. I think this gives me an opportunity to reread quite a lot of the key concepts in IR by constantly referring back to this pragmatic definition, determination of order that I tried to develop and which I have very shortly outlined. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next paper is going to be presented by Jay Gupta from Mills College in California. And his paper is entitled Imperial Ethics and Ethical Empire, Resisting the Discursive Valorization of Power.
Thanks, dude. Do I need this? Okay. I mean, just to put it quite simply, that my paper's a consideration of empire as a normative concept. So if you hold on to that thought, it'll make my paper easier to follow. All right. From a historical perspective, one might reasonably conclude that the notion of empire is ethically ambiguous. For in the midst of imperial processions of rape, arson, theft, slavery, and murder, one can often paradoxically discern the proverbial civilizing mission that all at once legitimizes, sanitizes, and absolves imperial actors and actions. As Marlowe in Heart of Darkness memorably muses, the conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. What redeems it is the idea only. An idea at the back of it. Not a sentimental pretense, but an idea and an unselfish belief in the idea. Something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. What is this idea that Marlowe speaks of? For me, I study Hegel. It's hard not to think of Hegel, the systematic thinker of the idea, and how the idea works its way into history. According to his account, the idea is arguably modern ethical normativity itself, with its emphasis on the equal dignity and autonomy of persons, actualized in the ethical, economic, and political structures of interaction that promote them. However, as Hegel famously notes, the process through which the idea is realized is not exactly benign. It involves the disappearance of entire peoples, sometimes in genocidal slaughter, undertaken by powerful individuals ostensibly out for honor and material gain. An important thing to note about this influential political theodicy is the equivocal way in which it collapses the realpolitik expansion of empires with the development and spread of politically modern normative notions. I say equivocal because, as I will argue here, politically modern normative notions possess a critical content that is strictly materially at odds with the motivations and tendencies of sheer power. It is a political theodicy that problematically conflates the global spread of modern ethical normativity with the brute expansion of political power. While it may be a more or less correct empirical account of the genesis of the global spread of modern ethical normativity, accounts like Hegel's, we should guard against any accounts of empire that seek to make it compatible with the global dimension of ethical life, which emphasizes universalist notions of freedom and equality. This is a point that is surprisingly worth emphasizing, particularly in light of recent discussions about empire, which appear to regard the notion as having some sort of salvageable normative meaning. So following the philosophical and ideological tradition that I just alluded to, sort of epitomized in Hegel's philosophy of history, empire is arguably an intrinsically hybrid notion. It comprises a complex of normative and realpolitik elements. In recent discussions in the IR literature, for example, the provocative concept of normative empire has surfaced as a challenge to the paradigm of a kind of allegedly softer, ethically purer normative power. A scholar named Del Sarto notes that on the model of soft normative power, the EU is said to promote and diffuse a set of principles, norms, and so-called values like peace, liberty, democracy, rule of law, human rights, that member states adhere to and that set an example in world politics. However, in a form of political skepticism that is at least as old as Machiavelli, this emphasis on normative power is said to disguise the realpolitik features of the EU as a necessarily realist power, strategically in pursuit of its own economic and security interests. While taking stock of the recent IR literature, Del Sarto argues that the dichotomy between the EU, seen as a benevolent normative power, versus a self-interested realist power, is a false dichotomy. While it may be the case that the export of EU rules and practices to its periphery embeds universalist normative emphases on rule of law, good governance, and so forth, it is no less the case that such transfer of rules and practices focus on regulatory convergence, efficient economic governance, and border control practices aimed at preventing unwanted migrants. And indeed, programs of promoting civil society and democracy in the EU borderlands take a back seat when the key interests of stability, security, and the prospects for economic benefits are threatened. Thus, there is a sense in which the EU is indeed a normative power, where ideas of democracy, rule of law, human rights, and peace are fundamental to the political and cultural self-understanding of its member states. But it is also arguably the case that the EU has the structure and modus operandi of traditional empires. And that is a vast, composite, and ever-expanding entity seeking to stabilize its periphery and draw economic advantage from it. So that any strict distinction, therefore, between a realpolitik interpretation of the EU's behaviors vis-a-vis its periphery and more allegedly norm-based behaviors is then said to collapse under a proper empirical interpretation that understands both behaviors as belonging to the modus operandi of empires per se. Well, there's certainly room here to raise the question of how well a robust normative self-understanding that emphasizes the universal ethical meaning of human rights, freedom, equality, and so forth can nest, as it were, within an empirical description of empire. The term normative empire seems to prematurely dispense with the fundamental tension alluded to at the beginning of this discussion between an empire's civilizing mission and the exercise of a brute politics of dominion. Neil Ferguson's much discussed book Empire arguably initiated a certain trend towards the normative recovery of the notion of empire. Sort of a retrospective empire. Maybe it's not so bad after all. Ferguson tells an essentially Hegelian story about the genesis of the modern world, where the blood on the slaughter bench of history is in some sense made up for the benefits of global civilization. But the basic historical question Ferguson asks, was the British Empire a good or a bad thing? A normative question par excellence. Should not be conflated with a general normative question about the goodness or badness of empires per se, especially since we are no longer talking about the beginning of the story, as it were, the story of global civil society, but we're rather somewhere in the middle of the plot. That is, it is important to distinguish between the genesis of modern ethical norms that we see embedded in global civil society, which incontestably piggyback, for example, on French and British colonial adventures, from mature critical deployments of such modern ethical norms in the modern world. So it is appropriate to refer to the normative empire Europe or normative empire America and so forth. Certainly the normative part of the formulation can be interrogated. And to do so requires us to use the normative language, where we ask, as citizens or officials, in what sense are we entitled to regard ourselves as a normative power versus a merely imperial power? That will live in the EU or the United States of America or any of the other empires that arguably still exist on Earth. Though perhaps not formulated in this way, this sort of question articulates a basic perennial skepticism that you see in Middle Eastern countries about Western political intentions. To go back a few years, Bush-era neoconservatives notably conflated a kind of neo-Hegelian normative language with the realpolitik language of state security interests. They spoke of the birth pangs of democracy and other exalted notions to justify regime change in the same breath as they spoke of imminent existential threats to our freedom and our way of life. The wholly empirical description of normative empire urges that this is just what empires do. The civilizing mission is just as real as state security interests, and here, in fact, they were regarded as inseparable. However, the empirical meaning of normative empire arguably works to obliterate its normative, which argues its critical meaning. If, for example, in a campaign of shock and awe, you end up murdering thousands of civilians in your project to democratize the region, whether or not it serves state security interests on pure normative grounds, you ought at least harbor doubts about your method of exporting Western values of freedom and democracy. Or if your aim is to promote democratic transitions in the Arab Spring, perhaps you should revisit your practice of cooperating with authoritarian governments and backing liberalizing trade agreements that end up fattening the pockets of local oligarchs and diminishing the livelihoods of the working population for whom such pacts are ostensibly made. These latter points also serve particularly well to illustrate again a strikingly paradoxical meaning of normative empire, understood as an empirical description. The merely empirical meaning tends to obliterate any normative critical meaning. Modern political science, going back at least to Weber, tends to bracket off distinctively normative questions and regard them from an empirical sociological perspective on how groups construct a normative identity or how individuals subjectively identify with larger groups and so forth. These and other locutions express a fundamental methodological skepticism about the normative capacities presently at issue. But it is this sort of skepticism that is bound to distort our critical consideration of a notion like empire and whether it is normatively salvageable. Indeed, Weber claims that the political association per se is to be understood empirically in terms of the means characteristic of it, not in terms of its various normative ends. The means peculiar to it is the legitimate, that is taken to be legitimate, use of physical force. Here, the normative question of legitimacy is quite deliberately reduced to a set of merely social psychological dispositions of persons to obey under certain conditions. It is, in a sense, shades of domination all the way down, as it were. This empirical emphasis on the use of physical force in conjunction with the deflation of thick normative notions like legitimacy has mesmerized generations of theorists. And it has arguably resulted in a strange sort of valorization of force as politically essential, to the point where, in an impressive feat of self-reinforcing logic, classical ethical and political notions can be dismissed as literally impotent. The concept of empire cannot be separated from what Arendt calls the logic of command obedience, that is, domination. In this respect, it is in perfect accordance with the Weberian model, which takes the political association per se to be characterized by a command-obedient structure. And if the Weberian model is correct, all political associations are more or less implicitly imperial, which instrumentalizes any normative consideration from the outset, including the question of legitimacy, which, as already noted, is reduced to a purely psychological question about the conditions under which human beings tend to obey. But then to take seriously more robust normative notions of the political association and of civil society, which, for example, might deploy Republican notions of freedom and equality as being essential to legitimacy, would be in effect to render the very notion of empire superfluous. For even at its best, so to speak, empire suggests a structure of domination, wherein normative elements might be at play, where institutions may even enjoy popular support, which are all, in some sense, politically epiphenomenal to the nature of empire itself. As Arendt notes, during the period of shrinkage in European imperialism, France and England were faced with a choice: decolonization or massacre. Decolonization, the robust normative political alternative to massacre, is anti-imperial in its essence and moves in the direction of imperial dissolution. Okay, one more page. To conclude then, there are no grounds for a normative recovery of the concept of empire. The global dimension of ethical life no longer depends on implicit or explicit imperial ministrations for its activation. It rather depends on a powerful combination of free communication, education, ethical imagination, and institution-building democratic action, which encourage patterns of self-determination in potentially free persons everywhere. What to do when such potential is crushingly impeded by authoritarian governments and violent non-state actors is a pragmatic question for all governments that comprise the civilized world, and not for an interventionist, imperial, yet allegedly normative authority. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last paper is going to be presented by Samir Puri from King's College in London. Oh, I'm sorry.
Our next paper is going to be presented by Samir Puri of King's College in London. And his paper is entitled Imperial After Effects and 21st Century Great Power Relations.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. So I'm from the Department of War Studies, which means my paper and much of my work is multidisciplinary between history and political science. This is also the opening gambit in an embryonic book project. So my ideas are relatively underdeveloped. But what I'd like to do is, and picking up from the last paper, rather than taking a normative position, my paper is a little bit more empirical, looking at a few different examples of great power relations, great power conflicts in a post-imperial setting of the 21st century. My approach is comparative, so I'm not providing you a regional exposition of one particular case study, but a few different cases. And I'll try to summarize my thesis in a couple of lines, so you've got something to follow for the remainder of the 15 minutes of my talk. I think a lot of us, and certainly listening to Russell's opening comments, will be very aware of the importance of an awareness of empire in terms of hierarchies as an ordering principle, as juxtaposed with the paradigm of nominal equality between sovereign entities. That's pretty much a state of play intellectually, practically, since Wilson, for beyond living memory now, that we've become accustomed to. My thesis is that we are certainly not entering a new imperial age. Rather, we are in a post-imperial age that is awash with a series of very important post-imperial dynamics. Some of those post-imperial dynamics, superficially at least, look very much like imperial dynamics, but the manner in which international affairs, expectations around sovereignty, expectations around equality and choice, the manner in which technology has started to transform political self-expression and identification and association, certainly in a developed world and definitely within my lifetime, almost certainly in a penetrative way to many parts of the world we consider to be at this moment in time still developing, means that those analogies to the imperial age, whilst superficially quite transfixing, are nothing more than analogies, and that we require a substantial reorganization in our heads as to what it is that remains from the imperial age, by way of comparison, by way, I use in my embryonic work, I use terms like the afterglow, or the half-life, or the residue. That's very much, I think, still present. But it's that reinterpretation. I always say to my students as well, many of the intellectual puzzles we face are questions of continuity versus change. And there are strong arguments for continuity. I'm sure we'll hear many of those over the next few days, which I don't push away completely. But I do think my work looks much more at the change aspect. So that's really my opening gambit. So I am very attracted to the idea of what empire and studies of past empires points us towards in relation to hierarchical ordering. I certainly think that the notion of polities that are expanding, often aggressively, especially coming from a war studies perspective, are certainly things that we need to study. But I'm very, very careful to avoid using empire as an analogy. And I'd certainly put that out there, and some of my interaction and questions with panelists to come probably will interrogate the notion of whether are you actually using empire by way of quite light comparative association, or are you saying there is something substantively similar or unchanging? I'm also very keen to look at breaks in imperial lineages. So even if I can see a residue or a half-life or an afterglow still in the embers, to note where in terms of recent, or maybe not so recent, past chronologies, we actually have quite discernible breaks with imperial traditions. Doesn't mean to say that that tradition won't be revived, that imperial or post-imperial, in a post-imperial setting. But I think very few of us would argue that there is direct causality between some of the empires we study in present-day puzzles. So that's another, I guess, part of what it is I want to examine. I also want to pick up on something else Russell mentioned about anti-imperialism becoming stale. I actually agree. I think generationally, for me, not only is anti-imperialism a little bit stale, I also think neo-imperial discourses, which were no doubt really prevalent, very powerful during the Cold War, as America in particular, and certainly Soviet Union as well, expanded power and influence in ways that hitherto had not been seen, through methods and modes of influence and, I guess, arm's length influence, which are only just becoming possible due to changes in technology, if nothing else. I also think neo-imperial discourses, whilst very relevant, are a little bit stale as well. I think anti-imperial discourses always have the power of marshalling the emotions that we have, often as very decent, civic-minded people, against domination, against subjugation, against control, against people's will. As a result, anti-imperial discourses and decolonization discourses are very powerful, very politicized, obviously. I think neo-imperial discourses are still very powerful, in particular with regards to consumerism as a form of colonization. I don't think those things are wrong necessarily, but I would interrogate both lines of reasoning, again with my main critique, which is, are you principally drawing upon the imperial age as a convenient analogy to marshal those negative feelings around domination, subjugation, and forcing people to do things that aren't necessarily that didn't necessarily come to their own minds through their own calculations and experiences, and again, therefore being very politicized. My thesis, when I've written the book in a year from now, I guess, will really be that the 21st century is, we're looking at an era of intersecting post-imperial legacies. Intersecting post-imperial legacies, not imperial legacies reordered, but post-imperial legacies. And with the remaining half of my talk, I'm going to move much more to the empirical side, just to provide some illustrative examples. The book will look at different examples. Two, very quickly, that I'll illustrate. Before becoming an academic a couple of years ago, I spent, in my previous life, spent a year on the East Ukraine border, doing a totally non-academic job. This was obviously the start of the Ukraine conflict. So very much immersed in what we would see as I guess, the resurgence of empire. And there's a whole panel on Russia, so I won't go into detail on that. I'll reserve my comments on that geographical space for that panel. So I'm very aware, of course, that the annexation of Crimea, which it's an aberration as far as international affairs are concerned now. Obviously the Kuwait annexation of 1990 was ended less than a year later through UN-backed, US-led military operation, which of course is one of the bedrocks of the unipolar era, was America's ability to actually do that. And I guess to almost update for the late 20th century, this Wilsonian notion that international affairs ought to be post-imperial, that annexation and old-fashioned expansion of control ought not to occur. But I guess the other inspiration for me personally for working on this, my family is 3 generations, 3 continents, as I say, South Asia, East Africa, and then I was born in London. The book originally started with the idea of, well, what impact has the imperial tradition of Britain had on Brexit, the mentalities of Brexit. But once again, there is no causality that I can discern. There's only a conditioning through, I guess, habit-forming ways of seeing the world from your own national position, from the perspective of having once been an imperial power, that are being reinterpreted and re-energized for contemporary questions of control and sovereignty and of protection of decision-making powers, which is the main sentiment behind Brexit. There's, I guess, in the British context, certainly a point at which Britain's national identity has been conceptualised in a way very distinct from Europe's. consolidation and pooling of sovereignty, simply because Britain thinks of itself as very special, having maintained such a large global empire. So I certainly think, both in the case of Russia and its perception of its own region, Britain in regards to the perception of its own notions of independence of decision-making and of its own special history, from the perspective of being former imperial powers, sense of expectation, sense of right of way in international affairs has obviously been accumulated through centuries of experiences of being previously hubs of formal imperial control. But I do still think that it's unlikely, and of course I'll wait to see what is said in the panel on Russia, that Russia extends this paradigm of annexation to other spaces. I actually think there's a lot of effort's been wasted in looking at the analogy of Russia extending its imperial control to the Baltics. I just don't see it as a very feasible way, and I'll talk about that more when I comment on the Russia papers. The RAND Corporation actually spent a lot of money and time working for the Department of Defense, producing a series of simulations about how quickly the Russian armed forces could take Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and energize those diaspora populations. That sort of then relies on the notion that Putin or his successors will effectively replicate one gambit that was used in Ukraine to another space. So I do think, and I hope, and I also think that Crimea is an aberration, which I suppose sort of partly disproves my notion of we're in a very much a post-imperial space. If there are more Crimeas, I will certainly be eating my hat and saying, well, no, we're very much in a resurgence of empire in a very direct capacity. So I've got 5 minutes, and I'll just run through another couple of empirical examples. So to save time, I'm just going to pick 3 examples of interstate crises that exemplify reordering in I always say to my students that I don't think we're in a multipolar age. I still think there's unipolarity as a very important feature of international affairs. But I do say that, by way of my own analogy, if America was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world in 1991, 92, it's probably the disputed heavyweight champion of the world today. Whether we've set sail from one coast and we haven't quite yet arrived at the next one, whether you believe that to be multipolarity or multi-order or even a bipolar possible system, some Chinese scholars write of that. That's really your own sense of estimating that the state of reordering is underway. Certainly when I entered the workforce 10, 12 years ago, that reordering is far more pronounced. There's so much writing, and Neil Ferguson's a good example, from the early 2000s. It actually seems very dated now, because it's still about what does America do with its almost omnipotence. It's that post-9/11 moment, which I'm sure there was a similar post-Cold War moment as well in terms of waves of scholarship and thinking. Right now, where I'm sort of sitting, my generation, that writing already feels quite outdated, not least because of some of the inward-looking lurches that American domestic politics have made. But the 3 cases I will talk about very briefly, Iran, an extension of power in the Middle East, whether it's in Syria, Lebanon, Russia, of course, with its near abroad, Georgia in 08, Crimea now, China, of course, with regards to the East and South China Seas. No need for any background, we all know what those examples are. I think there is reordering going on. I don't necessarily think it's helpful to look at it from a sort of resurgence of empire lens. I think it's better to look at all 3 of those examples based on their unique geographical context in a post-imperial setting. How do powers that are able to agitate elbow a little bit more space for themselves at the regional level? They're all engaged in a mixture of regional gambits while still effectively with the system hegemon trying to avoid great power conflicts. I published a paper last year which said that actually all 3 are executing their sometimes quite aggressive regional gambits to the tolerance of the US, not the acceptance, but the tolerance of the US. The US did not go to war in Ukraine. It took a very long time to authorize non-lethal support to the Ukrainian military. Lethal support, to the Ukrainian military. Is this really worth American boys dying for Estonia? Those sorts of debates are very much there. So these powers, respective to their own positions in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, and in East Asia, are effectively trying to elbow themselves a little bit more space while the US is distracted, while the US is experiencing a few soul-searching moments to extend power, and to play a very careful double gambit in their own sense of reordering, where the reordering is regional but not necessarily international. In decades to come, China might seek a greater international reordering, but at the moment it's actually the inheritor of the climate change treaty, which is things. It made 5 years ago to say that. To effectively take up some of those hegemonic responsibilities to buy itself space for that regional reordering. I don't necessarily think resurgence of empire is the best model through which to examine those dynamics. But I do think there are certain dynamics which are reminiscent of empire, some of the patterns, certainly some of the patterns of the extension of continental influence at that regional level. Of course they're imperial, because no one's actually moved these ancient civilizations to another part of the world. It is the same areas, probably the same relative disparities of political consolidation, of wealth and of military power that are playing out, of course, in 21st century setting. So I think we only got about a minute or so left, so I will wrap up with a few final thoughts. I think to say that countries that are building new empires, I find it to be a little bit theoretically insufficient. I certainly find it to be empirically unsatisfying when you start to actually look at the ways in which influence is being extended by challenges to America in certain parts of the world. I certainly would say that they're reordering their regional power balances in a post-imperial setting, and I certainly say for those sorts of countries to be successful in those bids, they need to be very aware of those post-imperial forces, not least one of them being a resistance to the domination of white European countries as inherited, by accident in some cases, and sometimes by design, depending on your perspective, by America. So I think that's very powerful domestically, politically, to stave off, but I think that's the utilisation of some of those normative trends that we've talked about. So just one last sentence just to round off. I'd say post-imperial sort of considerations are crucial to interpreting national political traditions pretty much everywhere in the world. My book will actually also talk about the formerly colonised parts of the world where it's important in its own way. But for sort of great power relations, I certainly think that those imperial impacts on their conceptions of rights-of-way and on international order are very important, that even if the world clusters and reduces in terms of the independence of the smaller sovereign powers, I don't necessarily think this will result in a replication of empire. Certainly don't think it will result in a replication of formal empire. If it results in a manifestation of control and subjugation that is very much of a 21st century nature, I think it's beneficial to actually arm ourselves with a new and updated vocabulary to explain those sorts of concepts, whilst paying due course and full attention to all of those imperial trends and traditions that we can still see as manifesting. Thanks for the extra minutes. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to take some time for questions. Maybe we'll go until maybe 15 minutes for questions.
Just a quick question for Lars, and on the notion of order. You talk about the desire aspects, the perspective on order, but I'm wondering, you can't basically want to order something that you don't know about. And I'm just wondering if you can relate order, the concept of order, to surveillance perhaps, or to the various technologies for understanding the world, seeing what's out there, seeing how people are responding to things in effect, and trying to understand, make more transparent what's going on. Again, taking your concept of order and fleshing it out a little bit in terms of the desire of order, perhaps pushing these technologies, pushing Google, whatever, to understand where we are right now. That my credit cards were used and what I read lately and all of that. Again, I was fascinated with order and sex and all of that, so please kick us off.
Okay, thank you for the question. The idea by reaching the conclusion that order is desire by reading the introduction of Kant theory of epistemology is that people, human beings, they spontaneously think in order. That is the way mind is functioning, and that is, and then we can reach all kind of interpretation of a given order that is the order in a house, or that is the order in a region, or whatever. That is the order in a subgroup in a society, and you can remember that because you feel yourself belonging to it. But I think this is very fundamental, and if you avoid having this into your equation when you study, for instance, political conflicts or on a higher level, I think you miss a lot of necessary components in the analysis, and this is so. It's not that a political order is a result of, you could say, an epistemological community, so to say, that you step into. Because of course, it's a dynamic. You can go out again and reject it. But these dynamics is crucial for understanding political developments and conflicts. And this is what I'm trying to develop by rewriting some of the concepts. The next step in my analysis is a discussion about, on one side, civilization. What is civilization, from Enlightenment and up to the discussion and quarrels about Huntington. The other side is regional security complexes. My problem in both is that the one, with all its critique that is well known here, I don't need to go into that, but one point is clear, and that is that it leaves me with an idea that culture matters, so to say, and it goes into my interpretation of order. The other one, but not the essential determination of civilization. So we need to get rid of this concept. But still, that explains better why feelings are. It opens a space for understanding why enlightenment will not do, because it's not only a question about thinking, it's also a question about belonging or feeling. And this is important. And surely on the other one, the regional security complex theory and all that, totally leave feelings, but also people, also politicians, also groups out of the analysis. And I think this is strange, because even if we cannot reduce politics to psychology, we cannot, of course not, but still it is people that is running the show. So we need to have this into the equation too. And this is the next step after this. And from here it's a long way to Google, I guess.
I have a simple question also for Lars. It is but triple because this question already linked circular. The first question, if the basis is Carl Schmitt in this nomos of the earth, is about this definition of Carl Schmitt of this nomos as a taking of a land. And my question is about this problem of intention in order, because if for Carl Schmitt it is an order, it's about taking a land, or space, or mind, or I don't know. My second question is also linked because with this problem of the hand, because an order must be maintained, and we can, for example, the analogy, not we can quite easily talking about peace or order. Peace and order must be enforced, must be maintained, and this is the question of maintaining the order. And the last, in beaucoup, it is a question more ontologically and anthropological and epistemological. It is as the moral philosopher Emmanuel Levinas say about the concept of the be, it is the be, it's a question of taking of power. As the example, the concept of comprehension. Comprehension is taking. Also the question of taking land as geography, for example. Yeah, Spanish.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm afraid I did not pick up on your exact questions, and my apologies. One of the questions, although, was about maintaining order, and of course, when establishing a political social order that we do, for instance, in the nation state, it is of course crucial to promote that interpretation by promoting a certain discourse, and therefore it is exactly important to have in mind the four dimensions of order, namely time, space, but also norm and hierarchy, and also border. Sorry, and also that the border is exactly crucial here, because what comes in might be disturbing the order. So kill it or leave it out or whatever. And I think this way of thinking is widespread at least in Europe, but also in the United States and other places today. And then we can have reasonable discussions, dialogue, Herrschaftsfrei dialogue, or whatever you will call it. But you cannot convince, because this is more than a rational argument. It's going directly into your stomach of people. And that's why as I hope this perspective will open also a gate to better understand things like fake news or on these kind of things. But I hope I addressed some of you, Chris.
Thanks to all the panelists. I have a comment for Jay and for Samir. Jay, I appreciate the fervor of your defense of, I'll call them liberal values of human rights, of free speech, et cetera, and your consequent criticism of imperial gestures of domination, the command-control economy. But by the end of your talk, you tried to mobilize support for your position by appealing to a notion of the civilized world. That's quote unquote. That term itself is thoroughly embedded in historical discourses of imperial domination. So I wonder to what extent the purity of your normativity falls victim to a dialectic of enlightenment. Point one. Point two, Samir, thanks for your contribution and your admonition that we should think about empirical situations so we can sort through some of the issues ahead of before us. The endurance of empire, I think, after your talk, really means, well, we make reference to the classic European empires. There are certainly plenty more, but references to England and France, Holland, they're over. But they don't endure, but the terminology around them endures. But that's why we have this zombie anti-imperialism. It makes no sense anymore, but there's always a reference back there. I think we should think more about empirical cases and ask, what's imperial, what's national, what's ambitious, what's hegemonic. China in the northwest provinces Is it acting in a national manner? Is it an imperial manner? Is it a race war that it's carrying out against the Uyghurs? Iran, right? The Shia arc, right? Is that the Neo-Persian Empire? Is that a useful terminology? Or is this Iranian nationalism? Or is it Islamism at odds with Persian nationalism? I think we have to sort these kinds of things out and maybe begin to get some clarity on what we might mean today by empire, what we might mean by nation, what we might mean by hegemon or regional power or great power. Anyhow, thank you for your pointing us in that direction.
You know what? We're about out of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just have you make your contributions, and then we're going to just leave it at that. As some questions.
Thank you so much. Actually, my question's for Samir, and it piggybacks, I think, actually quite closely on Russell's question, which is about the phrase post-imperial, which is, a kind of bold claim with this implicit sort of definitiveness to it. And so my question is, if we are indeed now in a post-imperial age, what was the end point of empire, the ostensible end point? And thinking of Lars' mention of Cassella, I was having in mind this question, so is there a rupture where empire ended, or are there these residues, these traces that the notion of post-imperial can still account for? Thank you.
Well, I'm thinking mostly of Samir and Russell was stimulating me a little bit too. But aren't we, like 1991, maybe succeeded in the Washington Consensus has been established across the world? We can't have great power wars because we're so heavily interdependent with globalization and trade. And that changes everything. So now, when Richard Haas talks about the world in chaos, well, yeah, but it's kind of lightweight stuff compared to the 30s and 40s, This is very lightweight because I think the Washington Consensus somewhat has prevailed. And then the irony is that the Washington Consensus is being broken up in Washington right now by the current U.S. president.
So maybe just Jay and then Samir, you can just make some comments and then conclude.
Oh, well, I guess to Russell's point, yeah, this is very much on my mind when I was writing the essay. So I think it's important to make a very strong distinction between sort of the genesis of what we call liberal values that circulate through global civil society and those very same norms and values considered as the product, right, of long historical processes. Once evolved, once manifested, I argue they're materially at odds with the very processes that gave birth to them, right? So that's where we are.
Well, thanks for the 3 bits of feedback. Just very quickly respond to each of them. I think some of the enduring power of anti-imperial discourse is actually the fact that you can call Iran a sort of a pseudo-imperial with imperial ambitions, recreate the Shia present. But I still think it's a normative accusation because it plays to a certain series of shared assumptions. And this is exactly your point. I thoroughly agree. Rather than maybe an analysis of what the empiricism actually tells us in terms of that pattern of domination, it's still domination over and above sovereignty. It's a diminution of sovereignty, indeed, if not in name. So it's still working its way around that, I guess, Wilsonian structure. And that, I think, is why I'd agree with you that some of the problems we have in a historical perspective are actually quite lightweight. I mean, we don't need an EH car. It's not, the 1930s in terms of the threats of annexation and threats of territorial expansion, threats of rising empires, through the methodologies that those 1930s rising empires, Italy, Japan, Germany, were actually using. There's no analogy for that right now, or no comparator. And I've certainly, just on the question of why do I say post-imperial, I probably should have mentioned that in my paper. It really is like the framework of empire really flows from formal empire, and the actual territorial acquisition through annexation or dominion status We just don't have that sort of thing anymore. And I think some of those neo-imperial forms of subjugation through influence do actually require a slightly different vocabulary to make sense of, unless you just want to make the empirical or the emotive point, the normative or the emotive point, that I just don't like this and therefore it's imperial.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to take a break now. Why don't we'll reconvene in 15 minutes and we'll start the next session on time. Okay, thank you.